For tragically, across its history, there is no doubt that the church has been guilty at times of fostering negative attitudes towards women, or of baptizing unjust social structures that have seriously hurt women. For roughly half of the world's population, and for the rest of us who love them, the church's spotty record on the treatment of women, it can raise serious doubts. So what does the Christian story really say about the dignity of both sexes? Is Christianity good news for women? Well, this is a serious question that demands an honest answer, which is why for a longer form response, especially if you're suspicious of a man speaking to this question, I'd invite you to watch our QC Conversations episode with the erudite Dr. Amy Orr Ewing, who has extensively researched and written on this topic and speaks from her own personal experience. We'll put a link in the show notes. But before I share why I do think Christianity is good news for women, we need to pause to hear the weighty grievances that might tell a different story. For tragically, across its history, there is no doubt that the church has been guilty at times of fostering negative attitudes towards women, or of baptizing unjust social structures that have seriously hurt women. Otherwise revered Christian leaders like Augustine and Martin Luther have said horrendously misogynistic things about women, which, when coupled together with the male-dominated power structures that have made the church a bit of a boys' club, or the sex scandals or the theological beliefs that have been used to perpetuate abuse, these religious evils have left an indelible anti-woman stain on Christianity's record. So I honestly sympathize with women who might be tempted to walk away. I really do. But please hear me when I say that this is not the whole story, or even the big story. For it turns out that this dark portrait, lurking in the shadows of church history, bears no resemblance to the way that Jesus treated women, or to the liberating beliefs women have long discovered in the Christian story. So let's go back to the inception of the Jesus movement. What inspired Roman, Greek, and Jewish women to flock to the early church in droves? Well, in short, Jesus. No one was ever more of a friend to women in the ancient world than Jesus of Nazareth. But to understand the historical significance of what we find in the Gospels, we need to get a sense of a woman's status at the time. And piece together the sources and you'll find the classical world was not remotely dignifying of women. The Greek philosophers, Aristotle chief amongst them, tended to justify a rigid male hierarchy on what they argued were self-evident grounds. That women are inferior to men, endowed by nature with faculties only fit to be ruled and not to rule, which is why political office was off the table. There was also a deep suspicion of women as being too ruled by emotion rather than reason, or being driven by base desires to become a seductive temptation. Two themes you'll see play out in the Jewish sources, only now justified with a religious gloss. Philo and Josephus, for instance, record that Jewish women in the first century played only a supporting role in a male-dominated world, their voice silenced in public and their testimony considered unreliable in a court of law. Women may not have been worthless in the ancient world, but they were certainly worth less than a man. Enter Jesus. The Gospels record the astonishingly central role that women played in Jesus' life and ministry, serving both as eyewitnesses and co-laborers in God's mission. Jesus' incarnation was first announced to a woman. God stepped into our history through the virgin womb of a woman. Jesus' ministry of miracles was first launched by the promptings of a woman. Jesus' itinerant ministry was funded by women. His band of disciples incorporated women. His stories of redemptive encounters celebrated women. And his suffering on the cross was primarily witnessed by women. Jesus' empty tomb was even first discovered by women. And the most important event ever in history, the resurrection of Jesus from the dead, was first experienced and then proclaimed by women. So in a first century culture that devalued a woman's worth, the major scenes of the gospel all come to us through the eyewitness testimony of women. Dorothy Sayers, the famed public intellectual, puts Christianity's popularity amongst women down to the single fact that they had never met a man like Jesus, who didn't map out a sphere for them but elevated their voice and vocation. And this pattern was continued in the early church across the New Testament, where prominent women like the teacher Aquila, or the deacon Phoebe, or the apostle Junia, or the businesswoman Lydia were considered co-laborers in God's mission with the male disciples of Jesus, equally gifted by God's Spirit and of equal worth in God's eyes. A new reality celebrated in passages like Galatians 3:28. There is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. All of this represented a revolutionary elevation in the status of women. But it wasn't just Jesus, it was also Genesis. For the inalienable dignity and worth of women is something that traces right back to the first pages of the Christian story, where all people, male and female, are created in the image of God. Here's an historical thought experiment. Where do we get the now popular idea that a woman is valuable beyond her physical allure, her reproductive potential, or her economic utility? That isn't a belief easily justified by other big stories, religious or secular. Which is why, alongside Dorothy Sayers, the agnostic Tom Holland credits Genesis alongside Jesus in the Christian story as being the depth charge that set off a whole array of cultural liberations, from the abolition of slavery to the civil rights movement and, yes, the emancipation of women. To put it bluntly, there would be no early feminism without Christianity. For historically speaking, only the Christian story offered the philosophical grounds and sociological fertilizer to grow the core beliefs held in the West today. Now, it's true, there are some complex Bible passages that are hard to understand, as we have to remember the Christian story is God's revelation within cultures, and so speaks to a myriad of situations where women stand in the dark shadow of the fall. So please feel free to contact us for some suggested resources where you can ask away with your difficult questions. Truth invites questioning. And it's also true that Christians don't all agree on how to parse out the differences between the sexes and whether God marks out complementary or identical roles for men and women, a conversation that is as live and heated in our secular culture today. But here's the good news. From Genesis to Jesus, the Christian story is unashamedly pro-women, which means those places where the church has failed in the past, they tend to stem from Christians reading their own fallen culture into the Bible, pushing women to conform to some unhelpful stereotypical box, rather than inviting them to simply become like Jesus. So please don't write off the beauty of the Christian story because of the failures of the church to live up to that ideal. Christians are only ever catching up to Jesus. If you're a woman wondering whether the Christian story is worth believing, why not take a look at the Gospels for yourself and see why billions of women across history have come to trust a man in whom there is no darkness, and who invites them to come awake to everything they were created to be as part of God's good design, experiencing full participation in God's mission.
Dan here from Questioning Christianity. Thanks so much for checking us out. We are all about helping you connect the Christian story to life's deepest questions. So if you're enjoying the content, make sure you subscribe and click the bell on YouTube, and then go ahead and follow us on socials.